Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about the customs procedures and authorisations available for streamlining the new requirements for trade with the EU, brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Senior Content Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host for this afternoon. And thank you all for joining us today. This is clearly a topic of interest to many of you. We have several hundred on the call already, so a warm welcome to everyone who's joined. If you go to the next slide, please. I'm delighted to welcome back Amy Maltman for today's presentation. Amy was with us last week. Amy, how are you today?
Hi, Will. I'm very well, thank you.
Great stuff. Amy is a customs and trade specialist with over 10 years experience in trade and lots of knowledge around Brexit, rules of origin, and today's topic in customs special procedures. And we also have, once again with us, Paul Woodward, another customs specialist with the IOE, who will be helping with a few of the questions and has worked with Amy on the slides. Hi, Paul, how are you?
I'm fine, Will, thank you.
Great stuff. Now, before handing over to Amy, I'd like to run a quick poll on the next slide. And this poll is just trying to find out a little bit more about you. So which of these best describes your business? And the options there are importer, exporter, intermediary, haulier or carrier, and the famous other. Now, while you're answering that poll, a couple of housekeeping notes. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions today towards the end of the webinar and during a couple more polls, but please bear in mind we have already received a lot of questions in advance, so we'll not be able to get to all of your queries today. If you feel as though your question has not been answered, please do review our technical helpline or training and consulting offerings, which we'll talk about later during the webinar. And secondly, you will receive access to today's slide pack and a recording of the webinar in a follow-up email, which we will be sending over the next day or so. So please do listen in carefully to the presentation today. Now, if we quickly close the first poll and show the results. So here's how you answered. 22% of you are importers, 35% of you exporters, 11% customs intermediaries, 3% hauliers or carriers, and 29% other. So we close that poll. And over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much. Well, can you just confirm you can hear me okay?
We can hear you, thank you.
Great, thank you. So on the agenda today, we'll discuss customs special procedures and trade facilitation, and we'll look at authorised economic operator and CFSP, or customs freight simplified procedures, which is an import facilitation. And we'll look at inward and outward processing and customs warehousing, as it's also known, bonded warehousing. So customs special procedures, or CSPs, they allow you to store, temporarily use, process or repair goods whilst the import duty is held in suspension. And there are different reliefs available, and really the choice would be dependent on what processing or storage takes place, what the goods will be used for, and the final destination of the goods. Okay, so special procedures eliminate or reduce import duty, which would otherwise be payable. And import duty impacts net profits, so it's really important that if there is a way to achieve savings, that businesses are aware and maximise this as much as possible. And by maximising special procedures, businesses can remain competitive. Okay, so we'll look a little bit now at what special procedures are available in the UK, and there are multiple to choose from. Today we'll look at inward and outward processing and customs warehousing, so we'll go into those in more detail. We won't cover the next two today, but I wanted to mention there's also temporary admission, and that allows goods to be temporarily imported into Great Britain for a specific purpose. The goods can't be altered and need to be re-exported within 2 years, so that could be useful for certain businesses. And there's also authorised use, or end use as it's also known, and that allows goods to be maintained or processed for a specific use. For example, parts imported for use on a civil aircraft. So it's worth checking the government website to understand which of the special procedures would be best for your business. And just to highlight that there is a difference between customs special procedures, which really exist to promote competitiveness and improve export opportunities, and trade facilitation, which aims to simplify import and export procedures. So as you can see on the screen, delays and red tape pose a burden for goods moving across borders, okay? And that came from the World Trade Organization. So they also say that it's important to simplify, modernize, and harmonize export and import procedures. So in the UK, there are a number of different facilitations available. And today we'll look at one of those, Customs Freight Simplified Procedures, or CFSP, and that simplifies the import process. And the World Trade Organization also administers the Trade Facilitation Agreement. So that requires countries to implement trade facilitation measures for authorised parties or authorised operators. And that's where the Trusted Trader scheme comes into play. And in the UK, that scheme is called AEO, or Authorised Economic Operator. And we'll look at that in more detail now. So AEO is an internationally recognised quality mark, and it shows that your business's role in the international supply chain is secure and that your business has control of import and export procedures. In the UK, there are two types of AEO authorisation. So you have AEO Customs and AEO Safety and Security. And businesses can apply for one of these or both, and there are differences in the benefits that they offer, and we'll look at that next. So holding a customs simplification AEO authorisation allows for faster application process when applying for authorisations like inward processing or CFSP. A lower risk score, so that may reduce the number of checks that customs would carry out on your documents and on your goods. And also allows for a guarantee waiver for the full duty deferment account value, and that means that you don't need to have a financial guarantee for your deferment account if you hold AEOC, okay, AEO Customs. And then moving on to looking at the benefits of AEO security and safety, again, a lower risk score, which may reduce the number of checks that customs carry out on your documents and goods. And your consignments might receive priority treatment for customs controls. Additionally, when required to make pre-arrival and departure summary declarations, AEOs will be able to omit certain data elements from the declarations. That's where it could be AEO security and safety could be beneficial for a carrier. And it allows for reciprocal arrangements and mutual recognition, and we'll talk about that in more detail in the next slide. But in summary, having this quality mark means that you meet certain standards, and customs therefore allow a level of trust that companies who are not AEO accredited do not receive. Okay. So the UK is working towards having mutual recognition agreements, or MRAs, in place with other partners, and currently they have achieved MRA status with the EU, China, Japan, and the US. Okay, and benefits of an MRA includes, again, faster clearance at the frontier, less interventions, and lower risk scores. And in reference to the UK's relationship with the EU, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement contains an article related to customs facilitation and recognition of each party's AEO schemes. So that means that where goods are coming from an AEO accredited company, the other trade blocs should recognise that and grant less inspections and controls and provide priority access for goods coming from that other country. Okay. So a look at the AEO criteria. So you can apply regardless of the size of your business, but you must be a legal entity and be established in the UK and have an EORI number. And you must be actively involved in customs and international trade. And it's open to all parties to apply. So manufacturers, exporters, freight forwarders, and even port operators can apply for AEO. And once you've applied, HMRC will check to make sure that you keep accurate records and that you have a practical standard of competence or in other words, qualified individuals working for your business, whether that's through experience or education. And remember, the Institute of Export offers education and training, so we can help you meet that standard that's required under the AEO application. And you need to be financially solvent and have adequate security and safety procedures. So you need to be able to demonstrate that there's checks done on the boundaries of your premises and that sort of thing. So just a little bit about the application itself. So you can see on the screen the forms that need to be completed to apply for AEO. And before applying, I would recommend that you take a look at the forms that are on gov.uk, especially the C118 guidance notes, because it contains a self-assessment questionnaire, and that helps applicants understand the requirements to obtain AEO status. And for corporate businesses and corporate groups, you need to submit separate applications for each legal entity. And upon receipt of your application, HMRC will carry out checks, okay? And just bear in mind that it can take up to 120 days for approval, okay? So it's not a quick process. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Will, for the poll, please.
Thanks, Amy. Lots of good info already. So if we launch the next poll is asking, how do you currently submit customs declarations? The options there being lodge in-house, use a broker, or doesn't apply to me, or let's count other within that as well. A couple of questions, and we'll bring in Paul for the questions at this stage. And we've had a few on AEO, unsurprisingly. Paul, so one from Joseph asks, I'm a small business. What are the actual benefits for me as a small business to get AEO, bearing in mind it can be an arduous process to apply for it? And another question we just had in from Robin, if using an intermediary, is it worth getting AEO status or is it not needed? Over to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Will, and welcome everyone today. So yeah, the benefits obviously of AEO I think have been clearly identified by Amy in the previous slides. But you've got elements like guarantee waivers that you may need or can be at a reduced rate, consignments being fast tracked through customs, but if they are pulled for inspection, you can actually say, well, I'd like that to be done at my premises. So there's lots of business attributes to be aware of, which Amy kindly referred to. But also I think traders in today's world, especially in this post-transition world, having left the EU and understanding that the UK, the EU considers us as a third country, so rest of the world. We have the same treatment. We're devised by the same procedures, policies and controls as stated in the WTO. So really, I suppose the question is, how is my supply chain doing today? Am I seeing these blocks, these issues within my supply of goods to the EU? Are we getting extra delays? Is it becoming cumbersome? Are our lead times being extended? Well, then maybe you should be thinking about AEO with obviously the benefits which come with that, the smoother flow of goods. Then obviously this could be something that you should always assess, because like we say today, we're running through custom special procedures. There are specific procedures there which can look at this and may be beneficial to your business. So it is worth definitely looking at. And just to finish off there, Will, on the point about using I'm using a customs intermediary or a freight forwarder. So the freight forwarder, really, if you're looking at AEO, you would want to make sure they have AEO-S, which is a security and safety standard. That helps with that flow of goods and reducing barriers. But also, as a trader yourself, it may be worth investigating that further, because the custom simplifications would be relevant for yourself. So in that case, instead of using full declarations, you could potentially use CFSP for imports and other functions for exporting. So always think, well, if it's a person moving the goods, then it's a security and safety, which you could outsource. But the AOEC custom simplification will give you those extra benefits from how you processed your customs declarations and the data sets that potentially you might have to provide, which could be less in an AEO world. Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Paul. So it really does seem beneficial, AEOC, in terms of streamlining some of those customs requirements you may have, and particularly if you are experiencing supply chain impacts at the moment. If we close that poll quickly and show the results, just another point to add there actually is that the IOE does offer lots of training and consultancy offerings around how to apply to get AEO. And I think we've actually got a lunchtime learning webinar for our members tomorrow lunch on AEO as well. Only costs £50 for non-members. So we're going to go more into depth on AEO tomorrow, if that is of interest to you. But just to go back to the poll, the response, thank you everyone for responding. 15% of you lodge in-house, 61% of you use a broker, and a quarter of you said the question didn't apply to you. So the majority, 61%, using an intermediary. If you can close that poll. Amy, any surprises there? Is that about what you'd expect?
Not at all. I think completing declarations in-house does require expertise and systems, so it's not surprising that businesses haven't explored that further. But as we'll talk about in the next section, there is benefits for doing that, and I would definitely consider that for businesses who have high degree and high volume of declarations that are made for goods moving into Great Britain.
Great, thank you. Anyway, back to it.
Yep, thank you. So as I mentioned, we'll come on now to talk about an import simplification, which is called Customs Freight Simplified Procedures, or CFSP. And just to mention, there are different options available to complete import declarations in Great Britain. So there's the option of what's called a full frontier declaration. And that's not a simplification, but the default procedure that would be used for imports in the absence of a CFSP simplification. And that involves submission of all of the information and all of the data about the goods up front on arrival. And because of this and due to this, these declarations can take longer to complete and can be more expensive. Okay, so if we compare that to the CFSP process, so CFSP holds benefits for importers because it allows goods to be imported with minimal information needed at the point of arrival. And the UK border operating model allows for declarations for goods coming into Great Britain from the EU between January and June to be deferred for 6 months, and that the method of doing that is through CFSP. Now there's two options available. You can see on the screen there's the Simplified Declaration Procedure, or SDP, and that requires the submission of a Simplified Frontier Declaration, and that is then followed by a supplementary and final declaration by the 4th working day of the following month following arrival. And the other option is to use entry into declarant's records, or EIDR, and that involves the trader making an entry in their records and following this with a supplementary declaration. But EIDR has limitations and it can't be used for controlled goods. Okay, so on the next slide, we'll run through an example of using CFSP to import goods into Great Britain from Spain. And really the port through which the goods will enter Great Britain will determine how customs formalities need to be completed. So traders and carriers should always check the UK border operating model for details. Dover has chosen to use the pre-lodgement model, and that requires a pre-lodged import declaration before the goods board their means of transport in the EU, and it also requires use of the Goods Vehicle Movement System, or GVMS. So in this process, first using CFSP, the trader would issue an instruction to their broker advising of the correct chief CPC code, or customs procedure code, which would indicate that the goods will be imported under CFSP. And the instruction will contain minimal information about the goods, so things like the trader's EORI number, the value of the consignment, and the customs procedure code. The second step would be where the broker then completes the SFD in advance of the goods being loaded in Spain and provides the movement reference number, or the MRN number, to the carrier. The carrier creates a goods movement reference, or GMR, and the driver must have this in order to board the ferry in Calais. So the SFD, the Simplified Frontier Declaration, is assessed while the goods are on the ferry. And if the goods require an inspection, the carrier will be advised where to take the goods to so that they can be inspected. If no inspection is needed, clearance will be given, and the driver is free to continue their journey, and they will bring the goods to the buyer's premises. Okay. the broker sends a copy of the SFD back to the trader, and the trader then submits a supplementary declaration, also known as an SDI, using their software to Chief or CDS. And at this point, all of the more detailed information about the goods, things like the commodity codes, would be needed. And the supplementary declaration makes the payment of duty and import VAT if the trader's not using postponed VAT accounting. And lastly, the trader submits the final supplementary declaration to HMRC by the 4th working day of the following month. And there's different variations of this process. This is just an example. The broker can do all parts of the CFSP process, including the SFD and the supplementary and final declarations. Or the trader can do the supplementary declaration and the final declaration themselves using their own software. Okay, so if using their own CFSP authorization, the trader is responsible for ensuring that the declarations are completed in time. And in order to do that, they could use the management support data, or the MSS, which is ordered from HMRC, and it gives the trader visibility on a monthly basis of all the declarations that have been keyed under their EORI number. So that's a great tool for traders to ensure that the SFD completed, every SFD has a matching supplementary declaration. And just to recap on the benefits, so the process of obtaining a declaration from your broker should in theory be quicker if it requires less information to generate that declaration, okay, and that then gives quicker clearance for goods. But remember that that puts the onus for obtaining the information and making the declaration in time back onto the trader, okay, and that the implications of that should not be underestimated. And late entries can happen, but they should be notified to HMRC, and repeat failure could result in the authorization being removed. Okay, so it's really important that traders who are considering using CFSP are aware of when the declarations need to be done and make sure that they have robust processes around that. Okay. So a quick look at the eligibility criteria. Businesses can apply if they're established in the UK and they have a good compliance record with no criminal offences, and they need to keep records for 4 years, and they need to be able to provide and maintain written procedures. Okay. And the application requirements then, you need to have an EORI number and a deferment account, both of which are needed for importing anyway. You need to have computer software to complete the supplementary and final declarations, and traders need to allow HMRC to test that software as part of the application process. And the form that needs to be completed is a CNE 48 form, okay, and that's available on gov.uk. And remember that the Institute of Export offers consultancy to take businesses through that application process. Okay, so just to mention that CFSP holds benefits for traders who hold an authorisation for customs special procedures. So using customs declaration software package is beneficial when operating customs special procedures like inward processing and customs warehousing. So completing the supplementary declaration gives the trader the opportunity to manage their suspended inventory, so they can use that software to dispose electronically of goods, and that will help them when completing HMRC reporting as part of their customs special procedure authorization. Okay, so again, we can help, Institute of Export can help with that process through implementation of both CFSP and custom special procedures. And we'll come on now to look at those special procedures in some more detail. So we'll start by looking at inward and outward processing. So inward processing is a custom special procedure that allows processing or repair on goods when the goods are imported, the duty is suspended whilst the processing takes place on the goods. If the goods are re-exported outside of the UK, duty is never payable, and that clearly shows a benefit for traders. But it's crucial that there's an export declaration created correctly, and that would be used to discharge that IP duty liability. If the goods remain in Great Britain, duty will be paid because the goods are remaining in the domestic territory. But IP can still provide a benefit in that scenario if the manufactured product attracts a lower or nil rate of duty under the UK global tariff than the parts that are used to produce that product. And we'll go through a couple of examples in the next few slides. So IP goods can be transferred from one IP authorisation to another customs regime, like customs warehousing for storage, or to another IP authorisation holder in the UK. Okay, so traders using IP are expected to have a high degree of supply chain traceability. So in other words, they need to know where their goods will end up following processing, and they need to keep full and accurate records so that the goods are discharged correctly and accurately reported to HMRC. And that could be more achievable for some businesses than others, and it really depends on the size and the complexity and the type of systems and records that the business maintains. Okay, so we'll go on to look at an example of how IP can be of benefit. So in this example, an exhaust pipe is imported into Great Britain from the EU and is used to manufacture a car. So when the exhaust pipe is imported, the import declaration will indicate that IP will be used and will quote the IP authorization number. And this means that the import duty will be suspended. Normally, if an exhaust pipe was imported into Great Britain without using a special procedure, the trader could be expected to pay 4% import duty. The exhaust pipe undergoes processing as incorporated into a final car, into the finished car in Great Britain, and the import duty liability stays suspended whilst that car is being manufactured. And then the final stage is where the car is exported to the EU following manufacturing. So the import duty liability is discharged when the GB export declaration is created. And again, it's really important that the export declaration needs to contain the correct information, such as the customs procedure code, to show an export of IP goods. Okay, and ultimately here the benefit is that the 4% import duty on the exhaust pipe is never paid. Okay. So if we look at another example, I mentioned the possibility of using a different method of valuation, and that can be the greatest benefit where the products that are manufactured attract a 0 or nil rate of duty under the UK global tariff. So if we take the example of a PCB board, so it's imported into Great Britain from the EU and it's used to manufacture a laptop. So when the PCB is imported, the import declaration will indicate that the duty will be suspended. And normally PCBs attract 2% import duty under the UK global tariff. So the PCB undergoes processing into a laptop in Great Britain and the import duty remains suspended. And then lastly, the goods are released to free circulation in Great Britain, and the import duty is paid at the value of the final product. So in this case, the laptop, and that laptop attracts 0% import duty under the UK global tariff. Okay, so in effect, the value of the duty paid is 0, and the 2% import duty is never paid. Okay, so you can see again the benefit of using this method of valuation under IP, but when applying for IP, if you intend to use this valuation method, you need to indicate that to HMRC. Okay. So if we come on to look at an example of outward processing, or OP, it's a custom special procedure that allows processing or repair of GB goods to take place outside of Great Britain in a third country. So it enables businesses to take advantage of cheaper labour costs while encouraging use of UK raw materials. Okay, so normally when goods are imported from outside the UK, duty would be paid on the full customs value of the goods. So when you use the OP procedure, it enables you to claim duty relief on the UK goods once they are re-imported back into Great Britain. So duty is still paid on the cost of the repair and processing, but it's not paid on the value of the actual goods. Okay, so it's important that the OP authorization number is declared on the export declaration when the goods leave Great Britain, and on the import declaration when they return. Okay, and the CPC codes need to be correct. And businesses need to show that the exported goods were used to produce or were incorporated into the products being re-imported. And similar to using IP, OP requires supply chain traceability, accurate records, and a high degree of compliance. And we'll just run through an example of how OP works. So if we were to use an example of a washing machine, so when it's exported from Great Britain to the EU for repair, firstly, it leaves Great Britain, goes to the EU, and the machine's imported into the EU. So in this situation, the EU processor has the option of using inward processing to suspend the import duty otherwise payable in the EU, and that would require a separate authorisation for IP issued to the EU operator by the EU authority, and obviously complying with the EU customs regulations. And when the washing machine is brought back into Great Britain following the repair, the import duty on the machine itself is not paid as long as the import declaration is processed properly. And the import duty is paid on the charges for the repair plus the shipping and insurance costs for returning the machine back to Great Britain. But ultimately, this has allowed a saving of 2% import duty in the cost of the washing machine. Okay. So hopefully that's clear. We'll just look a little bit now at preferential import duty rates. So I thought it was worth mentioning that where your trading partners in a country with which the UK has a free trade agreement, there might be an ability to claim a preferential duty rate on import, and there's very specific conditions and rules of origin that need to be met in order for that to happen. So it's not always an option. But if it is available, using preferential duty rates would be of greater benefit for businesses in Great Britain rather than using custom special procedures. And really the reason is that using preferential duty rates would require less administrative burden. Okay, and claiming preference means that goods are in free circulation, so they're easier to move. It's less restrictive if you need to move the goods, and there's no limit on processing times. Okay. And quite often within free trade agreements, there's what's known as a no drawback clause. So this means that the exporter sending goods to a country under preferential duty rates cannot have processed the goods under duty suspension regime. So in other words, operators would need to release those goods to free circulation and pay duty in Great Britain if they wanted to offer their customer a preferential duty rate on export. But that clause doesn't actually currently exist within the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but it could come into force in the future. But that clause does exist in many of the UK free trade agreements, and it's really important to check that if you plan on operating custom special procedure to make sure that you are complying with the regulations of any of the free trade agreements that you're using. So we'll just look a little bit now at the types of authorisation for inward and outward processing. So there's 4 types of authorisation, and the authorisation that you'll choose will really depend how regularly you plan on using it. So the full authorisation allows for unlimited use, so it's most suitable for regular use. And they're usually issued, full authorisations are issued for 3 to 5 year periods and require renewal. And users might need a customs guarantee, although most businesses should be able to apply for a waiver. And then there's a retrospective authorisation, so that can be used if goods have already been processed, but can only be used once in a 3-year period, so it's not suitable for regular use. And it requires the trader to provide proof that the goods were eligible and that there was a business need and that the special procedures were followed correctly. Authorisation by declaration is another type, and that's where the operator is granted permission to use the procedure when the declaration is accepted by HMRC, and it can only be used 3 times in a rolling year, okay? And it requires an individual financial guarantee, but that could still be suitable for some businesses. And lastly, authorisations covering Northern Ireland and the EU. So those authorisations are held by businesses in Northern Ireland and could be used across multiple sites in the EU, and normally would require a customs comprehensive guarantee, although businesses can sometimes apply for a waiver. So just the authorisation checklist, it's just a high-level overview of the key things that businesses need to have in place in order to operate IP or OP. As we've mentioned already, guarantees might be required, so it's important to check if you can apply for a waiver on the government website. And if using IP, you need to decide how you want to value your goods. And the bill of discharge is mandatory for full authorisations and authorisations by declaration. And the bill of discharge requires submission of detailed information about the goods and how they were discharged. So for example, if you brought a part into IP and subsequently re-exported that part following processing, you would need to supply the export declaration number on the bill of discharge. And there's normally a deadline for submission of the bill of discharge to HMRC. And it's also important to consider the information that you need to make the application. So things like the rate of yield, which basically indicates to HMRC the number of processed goods that will be made from the quantity of goods entered into the special procedure. And for IP operators, the economic code describes to HMRC how you will process your goods. And there's a list of codes and descriptions available on the government website. And as we've referred to already throughout the webinar, it's really important to identify the correct customs procedure code, as this may determine duty payments. So if you process an import declaration with the wrong CPC code, you could pay duty accidentally. Okay, so it's imperative that CPCs are correct and that your customs broker is issued with a clear instruction on which customs procedure codes to use. And lastly, record keeping, and we'll look at that in more detail on the next slide. So HMRC expect businesses to keep records for a minimum 4-year period. And I've included some examples on the types of information that should be kept. And when HMRC issue an authorisation for IP or OP, they'll provide a letter with conditions, and it's important that businesses understand and comply with the conditions outlined in that letter. And having a robust record keeping system is key for operating any customs special procedure. Okay, back to you, Will, for the poll, please.
Thank you, Amy. So we've been talking plenty about them, but do you use any of these customs procedures or authorizations already? So we've included customs freight simplified procedures, customs warehousing, inward or outward processing, authorized economic operator status, and of course our favorite, other. Paul, a quick question actually. We've had a few questions picking up on the slide Amy had there, saying that sometimes it's actually going to be better just to use the preferential duty rates in a trade agreement than to use a special procedure. But there are complications around origin. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what those complications are and when, particularly for UK-EU trade, you would use an authorization rather than, say, preferential duty rates, or kind of what the complication there might be.
Okay, yeah, brilliant question, Will, actually. So thank you for the audience posing that one through to us. So so obviously rules of origin against a trade cooperation agreement, obviously if your goods, rules of origin are complicated, but both the basic premises, it is where the goods had their less substantial manufacturing change. So if we take that we had, I don't know, Amy's example of an exhaust. So an exhaust was manufactured in Germany. It was sent over to the UK, and then obviously at the point of import, then obviously there would be preferential treatment there because it's got EU origin. So therefore, under preference, there would be zero duty there. But then if the trader, for instance, then after import held it at their warehouse, not bonded, not customs warehouse, no special customs procedures there, and then a month later they had an order from their stock to supply the same exhaust to Northern Ireland, for instance. Well, Northern Ireland is, part of the single market, and they would need them to pay the EU potential duty going into Northern Ireland or into Ireland, because once the products have used preference and come into the UK, unless they are under a customs special procedure where duty is suspended, then obviously their tariff preference will disappear. Yeah, so that is, and this is where there's a lot in the press at the moment about double duty. Yeah, so obviously any goods from UK going over to Europe or Europe over to the UK, they will come in and they will, if use preference to minimise duty elements, then that will basically mean that they lose that preference status with their supplying on. Then they would then have duty to pay based on the EU tariff. I suppose when we're coming into that against customs special procedures is, if you brought those parts in to the UK, then you wouldn't need to use preference because they'd be coming under a duty suspension. So if you were then doing some form of processing towards that, whether it's repairing or building that with lots of other components into a finished article, those goods would still be in a duty suspension until they were exported. So in that example, then if we bring those parts into the UK under, let's say, inward processing relief, IP, and then they are exported from duty suspension to the EU, you could actually use the preferential rules of origin there with the trade cooperation agreement, because the goods have never entered free circulation. They enter the UK under duty suspension, and then they are exported. I hope that helps, Will.
I think so, yeah. Hopefully that's helped everyone as well. I think the big example in the media has been Percy Pigs, hasn't it, Paul? That's been
Yes, it has. Yeah, I was trying to stay away from that one because everyone mentions that, so I'm trying to stay clear of something which is very popular at the moment.
popular is good. Percy Pigs, everyone knows what Percy Pigs are all about.
They did it.
Good
They didn't
example.
before, but they do now.
Anyway, thanks, Paul. If you can close that poll. Yeah. And so in terms of the results, always interesting. So 23% of you are using CFSP, 13% using customs warehousing, 23% using inward or outward processing, 21% using AEO, and 50% using other. So I don't know if people are selecting that because they aren't using any, or whether they are using other ones as well. So it'd be really interesting to see what other procedures people are using. So thank you everyone for answering that poll. Amy, any surprises on that result?
No, it's kind of an even spread, well, isn't it, around kind of similar figures for AO, CFSP, IP, and customs warehousing. I would say the 50% probably don't use any special procedures because they've never really had to if they trade with the EU. So as now that we've left, the UK has left the EU, there's definitely opportunity now that there's an international border and potential for import duty and import and export declarations. To maximise using these special procedures, they're there to encourage export and growth. So businesses, I would definitely recommend, if you're not using one, to look at your business model and look to see what procedures are available, and because you could be, you could be losing out by not doing so.
Thanks, Amy. And just a couple of quick points actually before I hand back to you. Someone just pointed out the results add up to more than 100%. That's because people could pick multiple answers. So I should have said that when I asked the question. So it was a multiple choice answer, that one. And another quick correction from something I said earlier, the AEO webinar on the lunchtime learnings is actually taking place on Thursday, not tomorrow, I think, which is what I said earlier. Anyway, if you can close that poll, back to the final part of the presentation.
Thank you, Will. Yep, so we'll come on now to look at customs warehousing, and that'll end the presentation today. So customs warehousing, it's another customs special procedure, and it allows storage and or minimal processing on goods imported into Great Britain. So in the same way as before with IP and OP, goods are entered to the customs warehousing by way of the CPC code, and the duty is suspended while the goods are being stored. Okay, so import duty liability is discharged by moving goods to another customs warehouse or to another customs procedure like IP, or by re-exporting the goods outside of Great Britain. And you can also release the goods to free circulation and pay the UK duty applicable at a later date following import. And the import duty would be payable at the UK global tariff, and that will be necessary for goods that will stay in the UK customs territory. And like IP, it's really important that the customs declaration is processed correctly, okay, and that the customs procedure codes are correct. Okay. So in this example, we'll look at batteries that are imported into Great Britain for storage and distribution across the UK and the EU. So the import duty is suspended when the goods are held in the warehouse, and if importing batteries into Great Britain without using special procedures, a trader can expect to pay 4% import duty. Okay, so the batteries are held in the customs warehouse and then are packed for distribution. And whilst that happens, the import duty remains suspended. The batteries are then exported from Great Britain to Ireland. And when the GB export declaration is created, that will discharge the import duty liability. So ultimately, the saving and the benefit is 4% duty on the batteries that is never paid. As I mentioned, minimal processing is allowed. So the customs warehousing is designed for storage, but there is an allowance for certain operations that can happen in a warehouse. Examples of the operations would be things like stock taking, sampling, addition of goods to meet technical standards. And there is specific guidance on this on gov.uk, so it's advisable to check this carefully if you plan on completing any operations and goods other than to store them whilst they're in the customs warehouse. So there's two types of authorisations available in the UK. UK only and authorisations covering NI and the EU. And there's also two types of warehouse. So there's a private warehouse, which is for businesses who want to store their own goods. There's public warehouses, which are for businesses who want to store goods belonging to other people. So for example, logistics companies can use their customs warehouse to store goods for other businesses. Okay. And just in terms of an authorisation and the requirements in order to operate a customs warehouse, as always, the declarations declaring the goods into and out of the warehouse need to be correct. And operations of a customs warehouse requires an accounting system to show which goods enter, remain and leave the warehouse. Okay. An HMRC will advise if you need a customs comprehensive guarantee when you apply. And there must be adequate control and security of the goods. So the goods should not be accessed and should not be moved outside of the warehouse without the records being properly updated. And when applying for customs warehouse, operators are expected to grant HMRC access to their premises, to their records and to their goods. Okay, that's standard procedure. So as always, some useful links. Using customs special procedures and authorisations certainly offer benefits, but the requirements for operating those procedures, they shouldn't be underestimated. And it's important that if you want to apply for one of these authorisations or special procedures, that you do your research. The government website has a lot of information. So we will include these links are included obviously in the presentation, and you'll receive these following the webinar today. So I think that's all. Will, hopefully you found the webinar useful, and I'll pass back to you, Will.
Thanks, Amy. And yeah, before we get into Q&A, just a reminder, I've said it a couple of times during the webinar, but there is further support that IOE provides for traders who are new to these procedures. Particularly, I know sometimes some people think the webinars can be quite introductory and you'd rather have some kind of more practical support, but this is where you can get it. So whether it's for our technical helpline to answer specific questions you may have, our one-day training courses to kind of get more in depth and more kind of practical understanding of these topics. The lunchtime learning sessions where we kind of go into all the different topics, but in a bit more detail, particularly in reference to a trade deal. And there's other benefits as well, including consultancy support as well, which you should definitely avail of if this is something which is really concerning you. Anyway, if we move on to the next slide, we are on to questions. So thank you, everyone. Loads of questions coming in. The first one I'm going to ask is from Sati. We've had a few people asking about repairs. So Sati needs to know if EU repair units can be imported via inward processing, if being returned for repair processing. And Paul, I think you're going to answer this one, but do you have anything else to say around repairs and returned goods in particular? We've had a few questions on that topic.
Okay, so yeah, I can take that one. So if the goods are exported to the EU and brought back to Great Britain for repair, IP can be used and the liability could be discharged when the goods are re-exported. So I suppose that's the main premise of it, and obviously how that can be assisted. I mean, Amy, would you have any other comments in regard to OP at all?
Absolutely, Paul. So where goods are, so the EU operators sending goods to Great Britain for repair, inward processing could be used in Great Britain, and
Yeah,
outward processing can be used in the EU. You know, so the
exactly.
two authorisations could marry up. And you mentioned return goods. Well, so there is also the option of return goods relief. And return goods relief is not a custom special procedure. Okay, it's just an option that businesses have if they have evidence that they exported goods and they bring them back into the territory, they can claim relief, okay, and it's through use of the CPC code. But it's important to say you don't need to have a special procedure. You just need to know what CPC code that you need to use, and as I say, you need to have evidence of that initial export.
Yeah, I suppose there the record keeping is really key, Amy, as we've mentioned
Absolutely.
already. Having systems in place which can manage that. And when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about a bill of material. So I'm producing this finished product. These are all the components which I use to manufacture in order to sell that. So there's a good one. Also, just coming back on what Amy said then, also the drawback clause. Think of the trade cooperation agreement. I mean, lots of EU agreements, let alone the UK ones, have that clause where no drawback is allowed. At the moment,
Mm-hmm.
we can use these processes, whether you're in the EU or Great Britain, and still use preference if you were to import it. So why it's
Absolutely.
still there, traders should be really keen to utilise that for their
Mm-hmm.
business operations. Back to you, Will.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Amy. And picking up on one of the points you made, Amy, actually, so it's around CPC codes. So Izzy has asked, well, actually, first of all, could you explain what CPC codes are? And Izzy has asked, where do I find the correct one for my goods?
I'll take that. Well, yeah. So CPC codes are customs procedure codes. They're a 7-digit code that is processed on an import and an export declaration, and it indicates to HMRC how the goods will be treated. So there's a certain CPC code that would be used when importing into free circulation and paying duty, and there's a different customs procedure code that indicates to HMRC if you plan on using a custom special procedure. So in terms of where to find the codes, so it really depends on the system that's being used, whether that's Chief or CDS. If it's Chief, you would need to check the trade tariff for Chief. And remember that there's different trade tariff for import and export. And the customs procedure codes have now been replaced by what's called procedure codes and additional procedure codes in CDS. I don't think CDS use is that common in Great Britain though. So really the focus would probably be on checking the CPC code that you're using is correct. And as we've mentioned throughout the webinar, we do hold and we have consultancy that can help businesses identify the correct CPC code for their goods.
Yep.
Great, thanks both. A few questions in around inward processing. So Hemant, I hope I've said that correctly, has asked, what is the process for applying for IP authorization and what info is required to apply for it? And then Ruth has asked, is there a time limit to IP as a process? Paul, do you want to say that one?
I
Or
was going
Amy,
to say, do
sorry.
you want more, either?
Amy started, so I'll let her continue. But I'll jump in.
The application process, I think we've run through in the webinar today. So there is an application form that needs to be filled in on the government website. And IP authorisations, as I mentioned, they're usually issued for 3 to 5 year periods, and they do require renewal. So whenever the end of the 3-year period comes up, the business should reapply, if you like. And if anything's changed, they would need to make HMRC aware.
I suppose there also, Amy, when you're talking about the application process, it's key for business to understand what suits their operation. Is it that one-off application for retrospective?
Mm-hmm.
Do you do it really infrequently, so you want to do it by declaration level, or
Mm-hmm.
are you actually doing it all the time, so a full authorization would be
Authorization.
required?
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, and this is it. I mean, businesses should be aware to evaluate how they want to use the operation, because that will depend what application type you should take, surely.
Yeah, and just a wee plug, Will, so you mentioned the lunchtime learnings. There was an inward and outward processing lunchtime learning webinar a couple of weeks ago, so that is available in the member library for businesses who want to consider, and it's a little bit more in depth in the webinar that we've done today.
Yeah.
I've had a couple more questions. So actually, someone was just while we're still on inward processing, someone has asked, do I need a guarantee for operating inward processing? And then Humphrey has also asked, do you need to be CFSP authorized to operate inward processing or customs warehousing?
So in regard to the guarantee, I suppose there, I think Amy's made that very clear within the great webinar today. There is a requirement there, but also, you need to have a word with customs, because there could be a reduced liability on the customs guarantee. And also, let's just drop into the start of the webinar today on AEO, because if you get AEO, you could get, obviously, if we're looking at that, one of those couple of those benefits out there was a reduced data set when you're doing your import declarations, yeah, if you are, approved to AEOC. But you've also got the element there where the cost of a customs waiver could be removed completely based on your AEO status and your actual risk score. So they're important things to note as well when you're considering that.
Okay, we've had a question in from Annie, who's asked, what costs can a UK company expect to pay if it is using a customs warehouse in order to avoid paying duty when importing into the UK and re-exporting into the EU? Amy, do you want to?
Sure. So I guess it depends on whether they would have a private or a public warehouse. So if they were using a public warehouse, they would expect to pay the logistics company or the warehouse owner a fee for storing their goods in the customs warehouse. But if they were to look at implementing customs warehousing themselves, they would need to have administration. They would need to have headcount to manage the administration, and they would probably need to pay for a system. And then that would kind of bring those costs in-house and make them more manageable. But either way, I think it's worth doing an evaluation of both processes, getting some quotes if they want to use a public warehouse, and then looking at evaluating the cost of operating their own warehouse themselves and getting some quotes from software providers to do that.
I suppose it's always, Amy, that element of assessing what your duty exposure is during a
Absolutely.
monthly cycle. Then looking, 3PLs out there, there's third-party software which can do a lot of these removals for you, and imports and exports through the customs system, but there will be a cost attached to that, and let's not forget, even if you've got the software, when you apply, you still have to go through an audit for policies, procedures, how you're going to manage that with that software. So quality systems are really important, but also that offset there on duty. So if it's X amount, well, it's going to cost me this to run. Is it beneficial to the business? It could be, especially with our new position where we are not part of the European Union anymore. A lot more exports now than there were before.
We've had a few questions in about exports, actually, because I know there's been a bit of an emphasis on imports today, but a few people have asked kind of which of these procedures is best kind of placed for exports, or are there any other different procedures which are more applicable to exports? Amy, do you want to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we only talked about CFSP today, which is an import simplification, and there are a number of other export simplifications available. The Simplified Declaration Procedure, the SDP procedure, is also available for exports. And again, that's where you declare minimal information and then you follow that within 14 days with the supplementary information about the goods that you've exported. And there's also CSE, supervised exports, which is another authorisation, and that allows businesses to clear the goods for export at their premises rather than clearing them at the port or at the frontier. So it really, again, depends on the what the business model and where the goods are being exported to and through which ports. But it would be worth looking at the simplified declaration procedure for businesses. Again, if Alone saying that exporters normally have better master data, so if they hold the information about the goods in their systems, making an export declaration using all of the information up front is normally the best way to go if they have that information to hand, because the simplified procedure is a two-part procedure.
Also, probably there will to think about transit. I know we did a lunchtime learning session today, which I hosted on transit, but obviously look at that exposure with the EU that we have today. So obviously their exports were treated as a third country. Well, if you're moving, let's say, from Republic of Ireland through the UK land bridge over to Central Europe, transit's an option there. And even if it was UK going to another common transit convention country like Macedonia or Serbia, that's where your end products are. That helps a lean process, less restrictions on your journey and hold-ups, and also other elements that you should consider as well. So there's a raft of procedures out there, and it's worth companies looking at them to see what is best for their business needs and operations.
Great stuff. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Amy. We'll do one last question because we've not touched on CFSP specifically in the Q&A. A few people have asked, does CFSP, because you're doing two different declarations, mean you're essentially doing does that mean it's more work? Is one of the questions we've had. And someone has also asked, when exactly does the supplementary declaration need to be completed? Paul, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I can start on that one. Which one? Which one are you going to assign that to there for a minute, William? Okay, yeah. Well, let's take the easy bit first. Supplementary declaration. So when you're moving products, you're going to have your safety and security, and either an entry into declarant's records or a simplified frontier declaration that is then lodged. And then on the 4th working day of the following month after the goods have arrived, that is when you do your supplementary declaration. Potentially in certain data set requirements, that's when you'll be stating the commodity code. If anything went through preference, if it went through any of custom special procedures, so then either duty can be suspended or your duty liability is calculated to then pay customs what's due. What was the first part, Will? I can take that one if you want.
And the first one is asking whether having to do declarations in 2 stages means you actually have to do more work.
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you look at that, if you look at the process for simplifications, the data sets, you've got minimal data which you include on the safety and security. That can transfer over to your initial declaration, let's say your EIGI or your SFD. And then once you've got the supplementary declarations come, that static data is already included. So then you just need to fill in the extra gaps. So it's not so much as what we would use old term in the account in terms of double entry. It isn't that case. It's actually there and held, and then obviously you'll just add in additional information to fulfill your requirements by the 4th working day of the following month. I don't know, Amy, if you've got anything else to add on that.
Yeah, so I think the broker will normally do the SFD, and if they're doing a reduced data set, they would charge a reduced rate. So normally I think it's about half of what a full declaration would normally be would cost. And then if you then key the rest of the supplementary declaration yourself, then it's done by 2 parties. It's not really a duplication of work. On the point about the deadline, so the deadline for submission is the 4th of the following month, but you can complete your supplementary declaration the same day the goods arrive if you like. There's no limitations to when you complete that. It just needs to be done by the 4th working day of the following month.
Great stuff. Well, I think we have actually slightly overrun, so we're going to have to wrap up there. But thank you, Amy and Paul. So a really lively Q&A at the end there, and a really great presentation as well. So thank you both for the effort and time today. I hope everyone has found that useful. On the last slide, I think there's one more slide. Yeah, so this is just a recap of the support the Institute provides for businesses getting to grips with new customs processes for trade with the EU. These include help with any specific questions you may have via the members' technical help desk, training courses on things like customs procedures or customs declarations, and these include in-house options as well. Our members get discounts on these training courses, and I think some of them I think there's still government grants available. I think that grants are being revamped at some point, so keep your eyes peeled about grants information. And there's also consultancy offerings and 30-minute trade surgeries in which our experts can advise on your specific business circumstances. For more information about all of these, please visit export.org.uk. But for now, thank you once again for tuning in, and hopefully see you on the next one. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.